Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to be talking about the last book on my David Mitchell meta-novel, uber novel, bibliography little challenge that I've given myself, which is Utopia Avenue. And as you can see, if this was a conspiracy board, it would be riddled. This has got different colors for different books and different things that I've earmarked. This is a funny book to go to because the last book that I read was his first book, and so I've gone from his very first book to his very last book, which has been very interesting and I think fruitful in a lot of ways. So Utopia Avenue takes place in the mid-60s, I think is where it starts, or at least early 60s, and goes no further than like 68, 69 basically. The summer of love type stuff. And it's about a British band who never was, and there are four main characters and sort of a floating character, we'll say. There's a character named Levin who is a Canadian, woohoo, and he goes across the pond to Britain to select from other bands, kind of like poaching them, to form Utopia Avenue, though he doesn't know that's what the name will be called yet, to form a uber band, something eclectic, yet has its pulse on the moment so that he can, potentially strike rich, but also just navigate to the inner circle in a way that is his own, and he's not sort of bootlicking anyone else. And it's difficult for him to navigate in certain circles because he is also a gay man who is trying to navigate them, and that becomes a source of conflict in the book, as well as his past that is chronicled for us. Elf Holloway is a folk singer who strikes it pretty big as a duo, and then she has boyfriend problems, issues. They break up, she's left with a solo act, and then is poached by Levin, so she brings the folk aspect to it. She's good on vocals, she's good on keyboard, she's good on guitar, she's sort of like a central set piece, basically, of the band. She can do pretty much anything. Then we have Dean, who is a quintessential British bassist from a small town. Literally everything that happens to him stems from his socioeconomic status, and let's say his trajectory in the book is probably the most predictable, and he's unfortunately in some ways, the most centrifugal force of the book. Everything revolves around him, and most of the plot occurs in his chapters specifically. We then have my favorite character, Jasper de Zoet, and he is, of course, a great-grand descendant of the Thousand Autumns de Zoet, which is really cool, but he's also just like a eclectic character. He's sort of the Jimi Hendrix on the Flying V type of character, except that he's, super white, pasty, and ginger. He's free floaty and weird, and he calls it emotional dyslexia is what he has. He doesn't quite read people very well, and so he's always in a sort of performative state where he's trying to pass as a normal person all the time, which I found very impactful in his chapters. I think fairly well respected, and the most relatable character for myself as well. Then the final band member is Griff the Drummer, who I think is also kind of a quintessential type of character. Well, maybe not so. He's a little bit against type for a drummer once you get into the narrative of things. His personality is very gruff, I would say. He's got a very thick English accent, Yorkshire accent, I think, for Dean. And Griff has, I don't remember. Those two have British accents, though, that are told in dialect within the actual piece of literature. So you know that they're quite thick because they're told in that way. Nobody else speaks in dialect, so we don't really get a flavor for other types of regions and whatnot, which is kind of nice because sometimes when people write Canadians, they like to force about the boot and all that kind of stuff. So he's not a Maritimes Canadian, we can assume. And basically the way that this book progresses, it's sort of similar to Mitchell and sort of not. Basically, what ends up happening is each larger chapter has tracks on them, which are sort of the David Mitchell short story, novella type situations with a particular character singled out for point of view. And we get some of the plot occurring, especially in the first half of the book, and it then changes to their past, and that works really well. The first half of the novel is really strong because we get to see why they're musicians, what their past life has been like, and how that has influenced how their personality has developed and how that pertains to their actual music, which is really neat. It's more in depth than a typical sort of fake biopic on a band that never was is. Daisy Jones and the Six, or Opal, the final revival of Opal and Nev, that kind of stuff. This is very much more granular into the people as characters and their motivations and all that kind of stuff. It is trying to evoke, yes, the 60s and that era of music, the challenges and the spirit of the times, basically. But mostly it's about people, which is what David Mitchell is good at. The book follows the band from the point when Levin gets them all together to them trying to make it big and the various challenges. Usually they get in sort of their own way, but also they're trying to break into an industry that is getting super saturated, slowly but surely, with the kind of acts that are more tailored to what we would call commercial mainstream now, where they want acts that have a synchronicity, they're not eclectic, they're driven to a single point, they're popish, even if they are not performing pop music, they are trying to commercialize like pop music is, if that makes sense. There is a lot of name dropping, there's a lot of coming into contact with famous figures, and overall I would say the trajectory of the book is not very surprising in terms of the plot or the plot beats, but the heart of the story is done very well and grounded with the four characters that are being portrayed, and sometimes Levin. The best part of the story for me is Dezoot, because there is a huge tie-in with numerous other books with his specific chapter. And it's even better for me because I just came off of the first two books, read in opposite order. So that there's a character in it called the Mongolian that I had a lot of questions about, and had a little like theory about kind of, and this completely goes into all of that with his specific chapter, which was awesome. I can't say too much else about it without going into spoilers, so I'll just sort of do a little mini wrap-up review now and then go into spoilers and then go into everything. So the cool thing about it is that the prose are noticeably punchier and more interesting. There's some standout phrases that are really Mitchell when he's at his best, where you sort of are a little bit flabbergasted by the turn of phrase that he manages and the impact that it has after the things that have come before it, where he sort of has a whole chapter set up a very specific theme and then delivers on it very well, usually in a parting way of the chapter. He's very good at sort of cliffhanging chapters with a very specific thought or sentence that drives a punch home, basically. Like I said, the character work is some of his best. You can tell this is a latter Mitchell novel as opposed to the other ones where they're pretty well drawn but not so well. The voices are very distinct. The personalities playing into their music is just a really satisfying and in a like conceptual level type of way. And overall, I gave the book 4 stars, just because I did find that the overall plot, as I said, is a little bit predictable, and it feels a little bit fluffed up with a little too much pomposity of going into that specific era with rose-colored glasses. You know, it feels like a very loving treatment of some of these some of these musicians, and especially how their dynamics play out with specific people. But within the actual group dynamics of the main characters, it's really well done and a little bit subversive of type. So you don't see those aspects coming, just the larger arc, I guess you could say. I'll also mention too, this book, similar to only other book, maybe Ghost Written, has the most ties in to everything. This book ties into every single other book except maybe a little bit Slade House, but it still ties into Slade House because one of the characters from the Bone Clocks is one of the main characters in the Slade House too. So in that respect, it does tie in, but not as specific as all of these other books. So I definitely think that it's worth reading this book probably last. And as a trajectory from where I went, I almost, just haphazardly careening from book to book emergently, choosing what was next. It was like almost a perfect trajectory for me, I'll say. It gave me a sense of anticipation for some questions that were raised in, say, the Bone Clocks or Slade House, because then I worked my way back to his third book, to his second book, to his first book, and then his last book. So there's a sense of anticipation. There's new characters introduced in the first 2 books that I weren't aware of in the latter ones, and then suddenly that character's answers were delivered in this one. I can't imagine people who were wondering about the Mongolian from the first 2 books waiting so long to get answers for Utopia Avenue, because that would have been like a 10-15 year wait. I don't even know. I think his books are usually 2 to 5 years apart, and there's 8 of them. So I'm gonna go into spoiler territory now. If you don't want to be spoiled for this book in particular, then don't watch. Then after I spoil this specific book, I'll go into the ties for the other books that I read as well and bring it all together. Usually I do the other books first and then this book, just so in case other people have read different books, but there is some pretty deep connections that move along the meta-narrative, so I'll do it this way this time. So spoiler-wise for Utopia Avenue, what was predictable about it was Dean, who is our focus for the book more or less, does kind of grow up in a way. Like in the beginning, he's a nobody. He's beaten by his dad. He doesn't have much self-esteem. Then he hits the big time. He starts sleeping with everybody. He is like got the trope of the like heart of gold guy who would never mistreat Holloway, elf, but also is kind of like in love with her, but their ships passing in the night because they're definitely not compatible people. And so he, across the 5 or 6 years, or actually I think it's only like 2 years or 3 years, of which the book takes place from the inception of the band to what happens at the end, which is Dean getting popped and shot, which was the pretty, I don't know, it fulfills one criteria that I really like for endings, which is it should feel inevitable, but it was not surprising in the least, right? As soon as somebody has grown up and has an epiphany and he wants to take care of this girl who has a son who may or may not be his son, he's gonna do the right thing. As soon as he writes down that he's gonna do right by people after he has this spiritual awakening of an acid trip and sort of comes into his own being and is able to objectively look at his personality, he's shot down, which effectively ends the band. And then the last part of the book is Holloway having a little journal entry or a liner note that reads kind of like a journal entry about how the last Utopia Avenue LP came about after Dean's death many years later. So, nothing surprising there. Really what drives you to the book is just the characters and their interactions and dynamics. They feel realized, they feel like a actual group of friends who have some friction for sure and have conflicting feelings about one another, but have an underlying nested sort of care for each other, and not like the nihilistic view of some of these bands where they just like hated each other but were in it for the money and the chicks and stuff like that. So it's altruistic in the sense of like being in tone with David Mitchell books. He's very much concerned with depicting the best of humanity usually, and I really like that about the book. It's subversive in that way, but it also, as it's buttressing, it name drops and has a lot of people like Cohen and Janis and basically anybody that was anybody back then, like Rod Stewart, a whole bunch of managers of bands that even I wasn't aware of. He meets characters, or not characters, but, well, they're characters in the book, but real life people who feel believable. But when you're making historical fiction like this, you have to be very careful, because when you start name dropping and portraying all of these people, some of the buttressing that is there to contain the lies that you're telling, which is the fiction of Utopia Avenue, feel very exposed, because those things are so real that they are not like verifiable, even if they're well researched. And so it feels like there's like splitting at the seams, especially when they are able to gain some traction into the scene and meet all of these characters. Some of it's pretty neat, especially the Cohen bits and Janis Joplin having a party on the roof and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it just feels like it's too much fluff, and the book could have been a lot tighter, possibly. At 571 pages, it wasn't a fast read for me. Also, I took a little break from it at the beginning because I wasn't jiving with the language, and I thought that was probably because I had read the earlier books of Mitchell first, in which the voice isn't as refined and it has a different cadence. Basically, you can tell he's like weeding out weasel words, and so he propels a sentence off of commas a lot more than a word that would otherwise truncate it. And that worked very well. I took a little break, came back to it, and then was totally into the book. So it's probably the longest I've ever taken to read a Mitchell book, at like 10 days or something like that, but I'm glad I did, because it ended up being a 4-star read instead of probably like a 2.5, or ended up to 3-ish is where I was at before. There are definite moments when it reaches 5-star moments, one of which, the most exciting and cool thing, is so Dezoot in this is has been committed to an asylum, and the reason for that is because he hears a voice in his head that is called the knock knock voice, is what he dubs it. That like he hears knocking, and then he calls the entity in his mind knock knock, because they don't have a name. And this is in his past, when he's in his boarding school days. He's trying to figure out what's happening. He takes drugs, psychosoterics, is that what it's called? Psycho-something drugs, to manage the knock-knock persona, who is nefarious and has stated in a sort of like Ouija board type of way, where they ask it to knock a certain amount of times with a chart to chart the letter out, what it wants, and it literally just says that it wants Dezoot to die, and alludes to the fact that it was born into Dezoot. Actually, before I go into those books, I'll say, now I'm starting the spoilers for all the other books, because I can't talk about this aspect of Utopia Avenue in that chapter without pulling from 3 or 4 different books, so I might as well just start talking about those books now, and then go into the various other crossovers from books that I'm aware of anyway. So in the bone clocks, we learn that there is atemporal beings, Marinus and Shiloh, and a couple other people, basically. Marinus is the number one atemporal guy. He seems like he's sort of the leader, at least for a little bit, until Esther Little, who was leading them, was gone for a while in the bone clocks and then returns. And in this one, they kind of buddy up and help Dezoot in an interesting way. They end up examining Dezoot after Knock Knock has broken down his psychometric barriers, or whatever they call it. They have psycho something words for literally everything that they do. But anyway, they break his defenses, they encroach upon his mind, and Knock Knock possesses his body, and at this time we don't know who Knock Knock is. So he has called for a doctor to help him, though, and then Dr. Marinus and Esther show up and like freeze everybody in a sort of Matrix type way, pausing the program and deleting their memories and all that kind of stuff. And they go into his mind and find that they are able to play his memories like a film that's been stored. Memory is like a poor, diluted format that is able to be recalled from his master tapes of memory, basically. And so they're able to rewind and find out everything that they can about it, and it ends up being that they're able to go back generations through his mind in a generational memory type situation, because Knock Knock has been infected or implanted in the mind of Jakob Dezoot in the Thousand Autumns, which we weren't aware of. When Inomoto, the evil, for lack of a better word, abbot from the book, who had a harem, who was farming women to have babies that they killed and distilled into oil of souls that, when drunk, would keep them alive forever in a sort of necromantic type of way, or necromancer kind of way. What ended up happening was Inomoto was untethered as he died, and then followed a karmic thread, is what they say, into Jakob Dezoot, who had a predisposition to the atemporal beings / the other type of existence, the sixth eye, the people that were susceptible to the carnivores in the bone clocks, who they would find the kids who were predisposed to the sixth sense or whatever, and then eat them, basically. Jakob, we find out, is one of those people, and so Inomoto implants himself into Jakob, just like Esther Little was implanted in Holly in the bone clocks, and it took way longer for him to recuperate because he was dead. So he ended up being passed from generation to generation. Jakob is his great-great-great-grandfather, I believe. And so what ends up happening is he was passed down until he awoken in the latest Dezoot. Inomoto was the one that took over his mind. What they then did was excise Inomoto from his mind by offering him a cadaver body that was in a vegetative state, basically. And so we don't know what ends up happening with that. Basically, they say that if he causes trouble, then yeah, the horologist will have to rally and fight him or whatever, but at least he's out of Dezoot. And so that kind of wraps up that chapter. He ends up being saved and rejoins the band, and the story proceeds as normal, basically. So it's just kind of an aside, but it has so many revelations for Bone Clocks, for Thousand Autumns, for Ghost Written, because we also learned that Dezoot was briefly possessed by the Mongolian from Ghost Written, who was born in China and passes from person to person by touch. And Dezoot meets a person who enters him through touch, and it ends up being the Mongolian, who gives him a little bit of time, 3 or 4 years. He sort of placates the Knock Knock, who is Inomoto, by carterizing that area of his mind away. And so that's why he, for a brief time, is in a mental asylum, recuperates, joins the band and all that kind of stuff. And then later on, he has that Moto breaking his walls and possessing him, basically. So very interesting, very cool. There's also heavy spoilers for the Bone Clocks, because one of my favorite characters, Louisa Ray, who is a reporter for Spyglass, is in the book, and she is, we find out, bi and has a relationship with Elf in this. And that was really interesting and cool. In terms of like representation, I wouldn't say like, woo, like fly the representation flag on it, but it's interesting that Louisa Ray's story is not just like capstoned at the life and death threat that she has to escape. There's some nice stuff happening with her and Elf, and for both of them. And at the end of the book, we know that Elf is married to a woman, but it doesn't say who, so it could be Louisa Ray, or it might not be. I don't remember what the time periods are like between this book in the 60s and Louisa Ray. I'm pretty sure in Cloud Atlas it's the 70s and later on. So maybe something happens to Elf or something, and maybe we'll find out in the next book, right? Who knows? We also meet some characters from Black Swan Green. We also meet, like literally, actually, they meet, well, not literally, but figuratively, they meet Secundu, who is a radio personality who is in the first two books, and Louisa Ray calls in the Cloud Atlas and Ghost Written days, and the band meet him for a interview, which was cool. That was just a little tie-in. Black Swan Green, there's a couple characters. I'm pretty sure the main character goes by a pen name of Bolivar something in Black Swan Green, and in this book Dean meets a kid named Bolivar something, and it would have, I think, matched up because in Black Swan Green it's the 80s, and so it might be young enough that it is that kid, but I'm not 100% certain. The Cloud Atlas Sextet makes an appearance, of course. One person that Jasper knows has a copy of it and passes it on to Jasper, who then is inspired and makes a song from it. I think even the name Utopia Avenue comes up somewhere else in the other books as a dream. And then there's a line in this that says, Levin's still on the band's name, Utopia Avenue. I like it, but I'm worried. It sounds vaguely familiar. Where's it from? And Jasper says it's a gift from a dream. There's also a crossover with Felix Finch, who makes an appearance in the Cloud Atlas as a critic, and it doesn't go well for him. I won't spoil that, but he's in this book as well, which is a neat little crossover. And then we also meet Crispin Hershey, who is in the Bone Clocks as a adult writer, as a boy in this one. He's got parents who are famous stars, basically, which is mentioned in his chapter in the Bone Clocks. There's probably even more than that, to be honest, but the other ones are tangential, just like this. There's a ton of Easter eggs. I bet if I Googled this book, there'd be even more. So if you've read this book, I'd love to know what you thought of it. And if you read all of the books, how did you read them, and what trajectory? And anything else you want to talk about David Mitchell? I now know what is going on. I know what the meta story is. I know what the granular details are, ostensibly, maybe if I've remembered them all completely.